Hello and welcome to another edition of Empathy at the Table. I'm your host, Tony Anagor, and this is the podcast where we talk about everything to do with negotiation. The aim of this podcast is to shine a light on the different types of negotiators and the different types of negotiations there are in the world. It's not just a single vertical. There are many different, a plethora of different types of negotiations. And today we have a very special guest. His name is Saad A, who is a sales negotiator. He sticks specifically within that field, helping salespeople win more deals. Now, he and I don't agree on everything. He seems to believe that we are on the spectrum of empathy. We've gone too far to the left, and we need to bring it back to the right, where we're more aggressive in the way in which we negotiate. So this is going to be a great conversation. He's got over 8 years experience within his industry, and it's a frank, open, and honest conversation. I think you'll enjoy it. Join us next on Empathy at the Table. Hello and welcome to another edition of Empathy at the Table. I'm your host, Tony Anagor, and I'm really excited to introduce you to our next guest. His name is Saad. So great, they had to name him twice. Saad, welcome to Empathy at the Table. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you for having me.
So, Saad, for our listeners who may not have heard of you, could you maybe just share a little bit about yourself and your interest in negotiation?
Sure. So I live and breathe negotiation every day now at the point of where I'm at in my career. I just wrote a book on negotiation called In the Lead, Mastering Your Sales Negotiation. And I work as a consultant, predominantly teaching sellers on negotiation skills. I also adjunct at a university teaching courses on negotiation and conflict resolution.
Fantastic. So let's kick off. I saw, and you've in the intro, you've said that you teach negotiation to sellers. Now, that piqued my interest. Why sellers and not buyers? Why have you divided them out like that?
Yeah, that's the world I fell into, Tony. The company that we work with trains predominantly salespeople. That's sort of their list of clientele, so to speak. And let me just sort of tell you through that experience, Tony, what happened is I started to quickly realize that context really matters. If you're training salespeople, you should be approaching negotiation in a particular way. If you're training procurement people or buyer, you should be approaching negotiation in a particular way. And if you're training negotiation outside of that, as a general topic or as hostage negotiation, context really matters, and context is what should guide how you train and how you approach this topic. Oftentimes we have this tendency of assuming that all negotiations have much more in common than they actually do.
Yeah, well, that's you've really come right out of the gate punching here, because one of my big bugbears is, when you hear people say they are experts in negotiation, and I think, well, what type of negotiation, right? It's like saying I'm an expert sports person. Well, you could be playing chess, you could be arm wrestling, or you could be playing basketball. So, it does behove the next question, which is to go a little bit deeper. Which discipline in sport are you an expert in? And I think it's the same with negotiation. Why is it you think that people tend to just blanket all negotiation and package it together, whether it be hostage negotiation, sales, or procurement?
Yeah. I don't know, Tony. I feel, when we define this term negotiation, the way I think about it as just simply as an outcome-based conversation. You think about it as outcome-based conversation, it's super broad. That can include anything. Me and my 3-year-old daughter engage in outcome-based conversations. Me and my spouse engage in outcome-based conversations. And again, there's a tendency for people to bundle in all those conversations as if they're the same. In my training in graduate school, it was assumed, sorry, I was just hearing a little bit of noise in the background. It was assumed that the skills that would work in this context are equally applicable in this context, and are equally applicable in this context, and are equally applicable in any other context.
Yeah. Can you give some examples of those kind of skills that people, because I guess on some level there are some base level like active listening, learning to reframe and build value. I mean, these are givens. But what are some of the specifics that you've come across that just are not interchangeable when it comes to looking at negotiation?
So what's taken center stage in the last couple of years is the approach to negotiation that's been derived from hostage negotiations and the FBI's hostage negotiation model. In that model, what's at the forefront is this concept of empathy. It's this approach to influence that in order to get another person to cross the finish line with you really have to empathize with them. You have to understand exactly where they're coming from. You have to ultimately seek win-win outcomes. You may actually have to compromise and concede in some ways, but the ultimate objective in these conversations is to find an outcome that you're both satisfied with. Now, that does apply in sales, but it only applies to a particular degree. In the sales context, if all you're doing is empathizing with your counterparty, that's not likely to yield the most optimal outcome. Empathy is important in that context, but it has to be equally balanced with this concept of firmness and this concept of assertiveness. You have to draw boundaries and lines about what's important for you, what's critical for you. That balance between assertiveness and empathy in the sales context is unique, much more unique than any other context.
So, why would you think that empathy and assertiveness are mutually exclusive concepts?
They're not, right?
Okay.
And you can apply, yeah, absolutely. You can apply both of those two things in conversation. You need to find the right balance between
Okay.
both of those two things. And the right balance in this context is different than the right balance in other
Okay.
contexts.
Right. So what you're saying is it's the degree to which you focus on, depending whether you're in a sales context or a conflict resolution context, you would need to lean more on one than on the other, and it's kind of a fluid scenario.
So, and what assertiveness looks like in the sales
Yeah.
context and what empathy looks like in another context. Context should influence how you empathize, and the context should influence to what degree you empathize and to what degree you're assertive.
So, give me an example of what you would what being empathetic in sales looks like, and then what being assertive in sales looks like. What would that?
So when I really started looking into this and thinking about this,
Hmm.
I started to have these engagements with salespeople, and they would tell me about negotiation scenarios that they're involved in, where they're negotiating with somebody from procurement on the other side. They're a buyer, they work as a buyer, they work as procurement, they're procuring sources or services or products for their company. And oftentimes, what would tend to happen is procurement people who are trained negotiators typically will develop a bunch of alternatives, will come into these conversations, and they do an excellent job of really testing the resolve of the salesperson. They would say things like they have other options. They would
Hmm.
make demands and requests for really large concessions. And if you follow the school of thought that the way in which you should approach these negotiations is predominantly through empathy and predominantly through trying to find win-win outcomes, what as a seller you would find yourself doing is you're conceding and you're compromising and you're accommodating to the other person.
Hmm.
Does that address your question, Tony?
So, as an example, you would say, let's say, so you're the seller, I'm the buyer,
Mm-hmm.
and we are at odds with a price. So, somewhere along the line, you would see, you would have to concede something along within that conversation, and you see that as being empathetic.
Not necessarily, because I
Okay.
can still empathize with you as a procurement person. I can still, listen to you. I can still ask questions. I can still try and identify what's driving that question and if there are potentially any win-win outcomes there.
Hmm.
I need to balance that with also influencing your perception of how much negotiation room there is. Because if all I do in that situation is actively listen and ask question and be other oriented, then what's happening in that situation is I am giving the floor and the space to your concerns, and I'm not perhaps advocating on behalf of what I'm trying to achieve enough in this conversation.
Got it. Yeah, yeah. So I think you and I, and this is why I wanted you on the show actually, because we do see things from slightly different angles, but we agree on. There's one key area that we agree on, and I do like to have people who see things from a different angle, because I really believe in the work that I do is around building. Using emotional intelligence to build long-term relationships, long-term partnerships, to deal with conflict, and to shift the way that companies and teams negotiate internally. And that doesn't really focus specifically on sales and procurement. It's a different type of sale. It's a different type of ask. But where I think you and I agree is this need to create value for both sides and strongly advocate for yourself as well as for the other person in order to do so.
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. Tony, I'm going to build on that a little bit. What I argue in my book is if all you're doing in these conversations is just empathizing and just collaborating, then you're not creating enough of an incentive for the other person to start thinking outside of the box. And as a result, you're not going to truly land on creative outcomes. What I argue in my book is if your ultimate objective is to truly land on creative outcomes that exist outside of the box, you have to utilize friction to some degree, not in a way that's adversarial, not in a way that's hostile, but in a way that lets the other person that you are serious about what it is that you're trying to achieve, but you're also considerate. Once you balance both of those two things sufficiently to the right degree, then that's really when you start producing creative outcomes that aren't necessarily readily apparent in the beginning of the process.
So I'm trying to picture how this plays out in reality. When you say using friction, can you just give me a scenario so I can understand?
So let's go back to that metaphorical or hypothetical example that I proposed a little bit earlier. A seller
Yeah,
is negotiating with procurement.
right.
Paramount comes in and says, I want a 40% discount. We have other options. We have alternatives here. We need an answer within 48 hours. Typical scenario that salespeople find themselves in.
Yeah.
How does friction look like in that context? What friction would look like in that context is first, perhaps understanding where that ask is coming from. Inducing friction in that context would look like you justifying your terms, explaining your terms, conveying to the other person with objective data and compelling data for why your terms are fair and reasonable. To some degree, what friction would look like in that context is you holding firm before starting to concede and before starting to explore alternative options that would work for you and the other person. If you concede too quickly in that scenario, you aren't necessarily creating the type of incentive that would get the other person to take you seriously and that would get the other person to start together, helping you find options that would truly work for the both of you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm still kind of traversing through this in my mind to imagine this as a scenario. I mean, I had a conversation with someone recently who was hostage negotiator, right? And he's now in the corporate world. But what got him into negotiating? Sorry, he wasn't a hostage negotiator. He started off working in a special unit, organized crime unit, as a policeman, and he ran the unit. And he said he showed up one day at a scene where there was a guy who had turned on the gas in his house, and he was ready to blow up the house. And so he shows up with strength. He shows up with his guns. He shows up with his team and brute force, ready just to smash down the door and drag the guy out. When he arrived, he realized this wasn't going to work because the guy was hell-bent on causing damage. So they had to call in the negotiation team. And when they brought in the negotiation team, he tells the story that within 10 minutes, the guy was like, they were talking about the guy's music collection. And what had happened was he had trained himself, or he'd been trained to look for signs of weakness. He'd been trained to look for threats. He'd been that as a policeman, that was his job. And he showed up with strength. Whereas the negotiator heard some music playing in the background in the guy's house. and engaged in a conversation with this guy about the music. And they ended up talking about his music collection. And the guy laid down his weapons and he came out. And I remember what struck me with that story was the fact that he had all the brute strength that he could have used, but it actually, in that scenario, it just didn't work. It would have rendered him actually useless. What worked for him was his ability to listen for what he hadn't been trained to listen to. And so I sometimes think when you talk about these situations, especially in sales, and I've been in sales, I mean, I run my own hospitality company, corporate hospitality, so I'm always negotiating with vendors. And I know that moment when the friction kicks in, and I know, and it feels like a game. It feels like, okay, here we go. Here's the dance. Here's the manipulation coming in. Here's the tactics coming in. And I just, sometimes I think there might be a different way. What do you say to that?
Reducing friction doesn't have to mean that you're manipulative, you're hostile, that you're adversarial. There's a space that exists way before you get to that stage where inducing friction is fundamentally around this concept of assertiveness, fundamentally around leaving the impression that you have conviction and confidence in your ask.
Okay. So now, so what you're saying is getting back to assertiveness. People tend to equate being empathetic with being weak, which I don't believe to be the case. But what you're saying, if I'm right, and tell me if I'm wrong, is you have to be able to show in a sales negotiation that a degree of strength by sticking to your number and not caving in so quickly to the other person's desires.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Tony, in the language that you used a little bit earlier, is that these things, assertiveness and empathy, aren't mutually exclusive, that you can do both simultaneously. And that's absolutely right. Where I see sort of we as a field have gone in the last couple of years is much more in the direction of empathy and not enough consideration and respect for this concept of assertiveness, especially in this particular context.
Oh, Saad, I love this conversation.
By the way, you're the first person I speak to who, is involved in the field and who has some different thoughts on this. So I appreciate having this conversation.
100%, 100%. Yeah. Because as I said, I work in the field of conflict resolution within companies, team alignment, and building long-term relationships and partnerships, right? Based around trust, based around using emotional intelligence. Now, that doesn't mean being weak. It means understanding that your emotions have a direct effect on the outcome of any conversation. And it means being able to know how to channel those emotions effectively so that you ensure the best outcomes of the conversation. And also it means choosing when to be hard, when to be tough, right? When to stick to your guns.
Absolutely.
And also choosing when to I wouldn't say be soft, but be less strong, less tough, right? When I hear you say that we're going too far from being the tough, assertive negotiator to being the empathetic style negotiator, I think I need to hear some more meat on the bone from you.
Sure.
What are your data points?
So here's what I think about is when I take a look at how negotiation is defined, or ultimately what is the objective of negotiations. There's been so much stress in the last couple of years around finding win-win outcomes in interest-based negotiations that ultimately the way in which people influence and interpret that is it drives them much more in the direction of empathy. And as a result of not wanting to come off hard on the problem, they don't step on this assertiveness gas just enough. And ultimately, in my mind, when you approach negotiations, your ultimate objective should not be finding win-win outcomes. Your ultimate objective would be to secure the most optimal outcome.
100%. I agree. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So they're different because what I tend to find is when people go into it with the mentality of finding win-win, what do they tend to do? They tend to overemphasize the other person. The other person is important, but you also need to empathize. You need to prioritize yourself to some degree.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we have a principle that we say create value before capturing value, but, make sure you take that value off the table. Don't be afraid to advocate for yourself and be really clear about what it is that you want. But I don't think there is anything wrong in working with your counterpart to actually create that value, right? To build value. And whether you use empathy, emotional intelligence, however you do that. But I think by letting the other person know that this negotiation will actually work out best for us if we try and optimize, as you said, the outcome. Optimize. So what is it you're looking for? What are your non-negotiables? How are we going to build this together? And just be really clear and I think on your non-negotiables, it's important to stand your ground on those non-negotiables. I'm trying to think of situations where you maybe you can share with me where you think empathy has gone wrong in negotiations.
Think about this for just a second, Tony, to see if I can point to like a specific scenario or a specific example. The one that comes immediately to mind, Tony, is, again, I want to run with that example that I was talking about a little bit earlier. Somebody comes in, asks for a discount. People start to empathize. That's their natural inclination, right? For most salespeople, it's the natural inclination. Why? Because this is a client. They want to have a good relationship with them. They want to have a long-term relationship with them. And this negotiation is just one of many, and they're going to have to deal with them again and again and again. So they clearly don't want to burn the relationship. They don't want to set it up to where it's hostile and adversarial. And what will typically happen in that scenario, if they're strictly empathizing and why are you requesting this kind of discount? What's driving this kind of ask? What are you really trying to achieve? Is there any other creative ways in which we can structure this? What happens typically as a result of that is the buyer will justify what it is that they're trying to achieve, and the salesperson is likely to have to concede because the buyer is left with the impression that there's actually quite a bit of negotiation room here. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't obviously empathize. I think we've talked about this, but for the sake of listeners listening to this, I'm not saying that you shouldn't empathize or that you couldn't do those things, that you need to be very careful in making sure that, yes, you're hearing out the other person. Yes, they know that you're listening to them. Equally as critical, they're taking you seriously, and equally as critical, they're left with the impression that you believe what you're asking for is fair, reasonable, and merited.
There we go. We've met in the middle. I knew we'd get there.
We've got there eventually, Tony.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for sticking at it. All right. And I think that's a perfect example there of, we came at it from different angles, but we respected, I really I showed some empathy. You showed some empathy. But, I think we kind of were also very tough about, sticking to our guns and you didn't cave, but we've met in the middle.
That's what it should be, Tony.
Right,
I would argue that we didn't meet in the middle. We met at something that didn't exist before as a result of this conversation.
Wonderful. Yeah. I love it. Yeah. So let's talk about the attitudes that people have to negotiation. A lot of times I come across people who don't like negotiating because they think it's some form of skullduggery. They think it's some form of manipulation, and they don't like sales. And so when you combine sales and negotiation together, these are the two of the most hated words in the English vernacular. What do you do? Why do you think this is, and how do we solve 100%. This challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. And salespeople have terrible reputations out there. I mean, when you ask people how much trusting are they of salespeople, it's like not at all. We tend to be super skeptical of salespeople. Before I got into this field, I want to say that I almost had the same impression. Like I didn't know what to expect, what salespeople are going to be like. The reality is that salespeople are at the forefront of the organization. They're typically client facing. And maybe across the 3,000 or 4,000 people I've met in the last couple of years, Tony, they're all just generally really nice people trying to be helpful to their customers. Their attitude tends to be like, I'm going to have a relationship with this person for a long time. And therefore our interactions need to be centered in the fact that we're going to have a relationship, that these things like trust and warmth towards them are critical in the conversation. So for the most part, what I've seen from salespeople is they tend to be super collaborative.
And I remember hearing a story, just to kind of shift gear a bit, but I like the story that you were giving a negotiation class and you were talking about the Shaquille O'Neal deal. And the guy that was actually one of Shaquille's negotiators was in the room. Can you share that story with us?
Yeah, absolutely. We have these parts in our workshop, and you facilitate sessions, Tony, where you try to bring some of the frameworks to life. And I'm always looking at videos online and on YouTube, and there's videos from Shark Tank that I include. There's a video that I ran across from Shaquille O'Neal. Those listening that don't know who Shaquille O'Neal is, great basketball player. And the story is about his contract negotiation with the Orlando Magic, where he had signed for 4 years. He was negotiating a contract renewal was for $80 million. For any basketball fans out there, you know that eventually Shaquille O'Neal ends up not signing with the Orlando Magic, ends up signing with the LA Lakers. And I'm telling this story, and somebody like sort of halfway through a breath raises their hand, and I'm like, what's this person has to say, in the middle of the story? They're like, I used to negotiate for Shaquille O'Neal. And I'm like, what? I hope I get the story right.
Wow.
This is what I know about the story. I hope I capture it right. And if I'm wrong, please don't correct me and embarrass me in front of
Wow.
everybody
Wow.
else. Yeah.
I mean, that's I guess that's every trainer's dream or nightmare, depending on how you're telling the story, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Yeah,
and
Shaq in the yeah.
go ahead.
I have to- Oh, so I was just going to say Shaq is now in every major brand in the US. So
Yeah.
that particular person was representing them for a retailer.
Yeah, I follow Shaq a lot. I absolutely love his whole approach to business. It's like he's having fun. Everything is just it's like he's playing Monopoly and just enjoying his life and enjoying his wealth. I love Shaq. If you're listening, please get in contact. I'd love to have you on on the podcast.
That'll be nice, right? Yeah.
So you've been an entrepreneur yourself in the past. You had a tea company, Re-Tea, right?
Yeah.
Which you sold. Were you a negotiator while you were running that business? Did your skills help you, or was it afterwards that you kind of thought, if I'd been a better negotiator, then I could have done even better?
Before that, also, Tony, I was a landscaper for some time. I did that for 8 years and negotiated, on a daily basis because you're putting out proposals and you're presenting and clients and they're pushing back on price, and there's all these outcome-based conversations that you're having with them. Yeah, I didn't make sense of my negotiation skills or how bad I was at negotiation until I went through grad school, and I was like, oh shoot, that's what I should have been doing in these conversations, and
Mm,
that's how I should have approached it. And school heavily influenced my outlook on negotiation, uh, because it sets the foundation. But then I I would say then I had a series of incidents after graduate school, because graduate school, you develop like a thorough theoretical
mm,
understanding of the field. Then you start to have these like practical experiences, and then you start to have conversations with people who are negotiating in this context and that context. And then in that way, you start to sort of refine your ideology and start to refine how you think about this and what your philosophy is and what your approach is. I hope that answers your question, Tony. I know I went a little bit of circles there.
yeah, no. I mean, it's a conversation, so it's cool. I definitely my journey in negotiation has been quite similar. It hasn't been a linear type of carefully planned journey. It's one of those ones where you're up, you're down, you see somebody doing something and you think, oh, that's pretty cool. You do a bit of research and then you do some reading. I remember reading my first negotiation book, I guess, was How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? When I really think back. And that was like 30 odd years ago. But I remember reading that, and my overriding feeling was, does that stuff really work? I read that, because you look at this stuff in print or you hear it now, on video, and you think, does it actually really work in the real world, right? When you're under pressure and you're in, and you've got to hit targets or you've got to de-escalate this situation, does that really work? I have an answer, but I'd like to hear yours first.
Absolutely. When I reflect on my journey before getting into graduate school, I assumed very much that in a negotiation there was a winner and there was a loser,
Yeah.
and that I don't want to be the loser. So you have to engage in these skills, similar things that you have to show up with strength, yada, yada, yada. You have to
Mm.
advocate, you have to persuade, yada, yada, yada. And then I went through school and, well, no, that doesn't really work. That's not really going to get you anywhere. You have to have this mentality of win-win. And as a result, through this conversation, talked about how that concept of win-win and how you get there sort of was evolved as I went through the experiences that I went through. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's still a person to person interaction, and trust is going to play a critical role in how the other person approaches you. Warmth is going to play a critical role. And we know from research that these things like emotions and how a person feels towards you is going to impact ultimately how they decide and
Yeah.
interact and engage with you. So absolutely, they have a place at the negotiation table.
Yeah. 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 And I think that, does this stuff work? I think it works as well as you are prepared to apply them and practice them and make them become part of your natural. And I really highlight the word natural DNA. We've all heard them. We've heard people who've done a training course for a half-day training course, and they get taught these parrot version things to say, and then they go off and they say this, and because it worked in my training in a role play, you think it's going to work in real life, and they get hit by a truck.
Yeah. The real world is infinitely more complex
Totally, yeah.
than what we're able to cover in a session. This is why, Tony, you mentioned this concept of like negotiation expert. I always cringe when I hear that, because I'm like, how do you become an expert? Been in this field for like 12 years, and I still, at some points in
Yeah.
some situations, I'm hesitant to say that about myself, because I'm like, the world is infinitely complex. Interactions are infinitely complex. There's a million things influencing how we're deciding to interact and engage with you.
Yeah.
The best that we can hope for is, here are some skills that will guide you in the right direction most of the time, but you still have to be pretty good at reading your situation and understanding what's going on, and then
Yeah.
responding and going from there.
Let's bring things to what's going on currently, right? What do you think about AI in negotiation? How do you think that's going to have an effect on us moving forward?
I don't know, you see all types of conversations happening online about AI and negotiation. And I don't know if you've seen this, Tony, but Walmart has partnered up with a company that's using AI to facilitate some of their like the AI is actually doing the negotiation with some vendors. To me, at the end of the day, negotiation still needs a human touch to some
Yeah.
degree, but there's definitely a place and room for using AI prep for these conversations. I've done it myself. I advocate to people that they should do it themselves, and them thinking about, what does assertiveness look like in this particular context, and how could I frame things, and how could I convey that I have conviction and confidence, but also, what does this other person care about, and what might they care about if you were in this particular situation? All types of prompts that you can use to help prepare for these conversations. Where it's at, I think that's probably a valuable way in which to use it, at least.
Well, Saad, we're coming to the end of the conversation, and I know you've got a book out, and I'd really like you to just talk about the book. But let's talk about it from a perspective of how does your book help people, and who is it aimed at?
So the book is called In the Lead, Mastering Your Sales Negotiator. Tony, I'm going to send you a copy, by the
Oh,
way.
you're a
Yeah,
gentleman.
absolutely. But geared predominantly towards salespeople. Again, as mentioned a little bit earlier, context really matters. So what I've done is I've taken all the research and science of negotiation and applied only what's applicable to the sales context in a way that speaks and is tailored to that context.
And,
But
yep.
go
Continue.
ahead,
Yeah,
Tony,
yeah, yeah.
please.
Go.
The core idea of the book is that friction plays a critical role in negotiation. In some situations, you need to be deliberate about reducing friction, about making sure that the other person doesn't see you as an enemy. You're not their adversary, obviously. But also just as critically in some situations, you actually need to induce friction. And how do you balance both of those two things in the sales context is what the book is about.
Excellent. Thank you for offering to send me a copy. I definitely will read through that. What I really like about you, Saad, is that you stay in your lane, right? You're very clear. You've got real clarity about what it is that you do and who you're helping. And you seem to have a lot of experience in that vertical, and you stay in that vertical. And I think that's admirable, because a lot of people can get pulled one side to, and have opinions on everything. So I'd like to thank you very much for coming on to Empathy at the Table. It's been great for me to hear the other side of the table and just have one of those great conversations that, these are the type of conversations that I love to have. Maybe I like a glass of red wine and, in a bar, and people think we're talking about football, but we're actually not. We're talking about negotiation, and we're sharing opinions on negotiation, right?
We're nerds after all, Tony.
Yeah,
We're nerds after all.
we're total nerds. How can people find you, Saad, if they want to follow up on you and get some
Sure.
ideas from you?
The book is on Amazon if you're interested. But in addition to that, I'm on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/Saad A. Saad. So my first name, A, and then my last name. So probably the best way to get a hold of me.
Thank you very much. Saad A. Saad, thank you very much for joining us on Empathy at the Table. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Tony. Great meeting you. Take care.